welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So for those that don't know me, my name is Yuri Lepshin. I'm the Executive Director of the Renew Democracy Initiative. And for those that aren't familiar with RDI, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we have two overarching goals. First, we want to educate the public around classical liberal democratic principles. And second, we want to empower them to prioritize those principles in our civic lives. So what does that actually mean, right? So first, we want to be sure that people understand the principles that make diverse, open democracies possible. And second, we want to make sure that that the general public, that we're all in a position to actually make decisions based on those principles. Because what's so terrifying right now is that many of us, most of us actually, generally don't. You know, there was a really fascinating study that came out of Yale a couple of years ago, which indicated that even for those who rate democracy on a scale of 1 to 10, somewhere between 8 and 10 in terms of importance, even among those people, their willingness and or ability to hold their co-partisans to account for holding illiberal or anti-democratic views was around 4%. And that became true, that became ever more true the further people moved away from the center. So the further left and the further right you were, the less willing you were to hold your co-partisans accountable for any views or positions they might hold that might run counter to those classical democratic principles, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, which is how are we going to get these key liberal democratic principles to be prioritized among the general public? What are the things that we can do to encourage pro-democracy associations, whether on a local level or a national level, and get, and empower people both, again, locally and more broadly nationally to prioritize the things that actually make our democracy possible. And so with that, before I sort of introduce our guests here, Bret and Danielle, I want to highlight one very important note, which is that, again, we are strictly nonpartisan. We do not endorse, support, or oppose any candidates for office. Obviously, Danielle is currently running for governor in Massachusetts, but she is here in her capacity as an expert, as a public intellectual, and as someone who has written and thought deeply about a lot of these issues. And so with that, I'll very quickly make some introductions and then we'll get going. So Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and columnist for the New York Times. Previously, he's worked as a foreign affairs columnist at the Wall Street Journal, where he won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. And he is known for his incisive and frequently contrarian writing style, which, Bret, I think I've witnessed in private conversation a number of times. But thank you, Bret, for joining us here today.
It's an honor.
Danielle Allen is a Democratic candidate for governor of Massachusetts and is on sabbatical from serving as director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and is widely known as a political theorist. She's former chair of the Mellon Foundation Board, past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and the founding director of the Democratic Knowledge Project Design Studio at Harvard, which aims to equip citizens with the knowledge and tools they need to participate in the democratic process. Welcome, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Uriel. Really important conversation. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm
Awesome.
delighted. I'm delighted to be here just as a fan of Danielle's book on the Declaration, a fan of her writing and her scholarship, and also someone who just admires the breadth of your interests, Danielle. And I think they're particularly apropos of this conversation because you are not only a scholar of American history, you're a scholar of the classics, which is where I wanted to begin by way of some historical background. Obviously, the very words democracy and demagoguery come to us from ancient Greece, which was no stranger, certainly to the phenomenon of demagoguery. People think of Cleon of Athens, who I guess, if my memory serves, succeeded Pericles and was partially responsible for Athens's downfall, as was Claudius in the late Roman Republic, responsible for the downfall of the Republic. And when America's founders began thinking about the constitution of a modern republic, they were deeply conscious of that particular history, of how you make sure that a republic doesn't descend into destructive or into demagoguery of any kind, but especially demagogues that destroy the republic. Very much, I think, alive in people's minds in the last few years. Would you begin by reflecting on the ancient history and the ways in which America's founders conceived of that history?
Sure, I will. I'll start by telling a little story, though, which is sort of nearer history and a little bit of family history, which will be a story of sort of how it is I came to study the ancient world in the first place and came to see the ancient world as a valuable resource for thinking even about our contemporary constitutional democracy in this society of 330 million people. So I grew up in a family with just incredibly deep democratic traditions. Great-grandparents on my mom's side that fought for women's right to vote in the early 20th century, and a great-grandmother rather, that served as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. And then on my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida. So I just grew up with this sort of ethos of it's your job as a human being to engage in your community, to think about how you secure empowerment, how you secure that framework of rights represented by liberal democracy, and the recognition that it's been hard fought over time. And I took that pre-existing attitude with me to college and found myself one day just sort of drawn to a class on Athenian democracy, a sort of a little sense of kind of curiosity. What was it like in another time and place? And in that class on Athenian democracy, we read tons of those courtroom speeches, the orators, the demagogues, and basically the people on the other side were always the demagogues, it has to be said. That was one of the features of the politics of the place. And as we read all those courtroom speeches, I was really struck by something. I couldn't put my finger on it for the longest time. And finally, I realized that here I was reading all these courtroom speeches, prosecutions and defenses, and there was never any mention of prison in them. And so one day I raised my hand and said to my professor, what do these Athenians, they didn't use prisons? And he said, Danielle, that would make a great dissertation topic. And that is literally why I ended up going to graduate school and running down this incredible sort of rabbit hole of exploration into antiquity. But it is really a beautiful, wonderful world. And yes, the founders understood that. And what they saw in antiquity were these moments in human history where people had said, we want to govern ourselves. We don't need to be governed, by the elite or to have no say in our decisions. We are capable. Ordinary people, poor people are capable of contributing to collective shared decision-making. And they saw that and recognized a lot of the lessons for how you think about trying to check and channel power as being there already in antiquity. And it's really stunning, when you read the Federalist Papers, all the references to antiquity. Of course, we see it in the design of our buildings and place names all over the place. But the really important point was just this fundamental recognition of sort of two things, the Greek word democracy, meaning power of the people on the one hand, and then the Roman word republic, meaning the public thing on the other hand. That the goal is to glue these things together, to somehow pull people together, ordinary people together around a public thing, a shared purpose. And when we can get those two things hooked up together, you have the sturdiest form of government imaginable. You have the form of government that best delivers on safety and happiness for a whole population.
You've just whet my curiosity. Can you tell us briefly why there were no prisons or no mention of prison in antiquity? I have a guess of what the answer is.
Sure. So there were, as it turns out, there was very small use of prison and incarceration, but never became the whole system. And you'll probably guess exactly why, which is that in antiquity, exile was the major category of punishment. In fact, it was a major category of punishment for the entire world until the middle of the 19th century. And this is a thing that we often don't recognize, is that we live in a world that only for the last 150 years has not used sort of open space borders as a way both to deal with an infraction and also in an important way to give people a second chance. because people could leave. They could actually set up homes and start over in another place. So it was a strangely forgiving system, in fact, despite the violence of the ancient world. And it really is, the carving up of the world into complete, sovereign states in the middle of the 19th century that totally changes the dynamic around punishment in our world.
One aspect that I think, especially in the last few years, wasn't fully appreciated, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is people talk about demagogues versus democracy, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that demagoguery is an outgrowth of democracy. You might call it a cancer of democracy, but demagogues certainly always present themselves as speaking for, as they see it, the people against some set of corrupt or self-dealing elites. And reading the debates on the Constitution, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, at least my reading of it is the Anti-Federalists were quite enthusiastic about, what they call the yeoman democracy, very suspicious of what they saw as the more republican, even monarchical features of the Constitution. Is that right? And obviously, it's an argument that hasn't ended.
No, absolutely. So, the word demagogue literally means nothing more than leader of the people, right? So it is absolutely emerging from the claim of particular individuals to speak for and embody the whole people. And the real challenge of populism is that, in order to achieve self-government in any society, any scale, you need to build, institutions. You need to build processes that link people's, communication, their sharing of their perspectives about what's working in the world and not working, and turn that into a sort of set of, again, institutional processes that can yield a decision at the end of it, which can be a shared decision for the whole community, but ultimately doesn't line up perfectly with anybody's original starting point because it's been through this sort of sausage maker of decision making. And so it's that sort of sausage maker piece, the machinery of constitutional government, that you need for stable, durable self-government and stable, durable protection of rights. And so the problem with demagogues is that they sort of want to knock all that out and just let themselves stand in as if they and they alone can speak for the people and sort of channel the people. So the goal of self-government should be, in an important way, to speak for and embody the purposes of the people, but through these important institutional mechanisms. So yes, at the time then of the Constitutional Convention, I think there was broadly shared recognition about the importance of those institutional mechanisms for building really long-lasting forms of self-government. And then the fight was over, when you start building those mechanisms, how do they distribute power? Do they give more power to those wealthy coastal mercantile classes, or do they give more power to the agrarian landowners? And that has been just a permanent debate in our society ever since. But from my point of view, much better to have a debate sort of centered on the question of how we rightly balance those institutional mechanisms for fairness and just decision making. That's much better than like wiping them out and just thinking that there's going to be some, incredibly charismatic figure to whom all authority and decision making will be assigned.
And there's one other aspect, I think you'll agree, which is in addition to constitutionally created institutions, the separation of powers and so on, there's associational life. Tocqueville, when he comes to the United States in the 1830s, is fascinated by the richness and diversity of American associations, religiously, but also civically, as a mediating institution and a core part of a core piece in stemming demagoguery, because people's affiliations tend to be local, associational, avocational, and so on.
Absolutely. Associational life is fundamental alongside our institutions. And so maybe I'll say a word about each. We have lived through an incredible transformation of associations in this country in the last 50 years. And there's some interesting research. I think there's a book coming out soon, I believe from Princeton University Press, about what is really a sort of transition from union membership in many parts of the country to membership in gun clubs as a real sort of shift in the associational fabric of the country. Now, both kinds of association gave people a sense of security or connected people to concepts of security. They also very much simply support social life. They give people community, people to be in solidarity with. But of course, also both sets of associations end up getting networked and connected to the operations of our political processes. And so that shift from union membership to membership in gun clubs, really relates to some of the changes we've seen in how public opinion operates in the last quarter century.
So, I mean, America's been no stranger to demagogues, Huey Long, Joe McCarthy. Someone might make the case also Andrew Jackson. I mean, this has been a phenomenon in American history, but never at very high level. Well, Jackson may be the exception, but rarely at the highest levels, because these institutions have been in place both formally and informally. And so I want to bring us, you mentioned gun clubs, sort of closer to the present, because clearly in the last few years, there has been a recognition that the game has changed and that America is more vulnerable to demagogic political figures and phenomena than we've ever been before. What happened in the last 30 years that started to take place? I mean, big question, but start wherever you'd like.
No, absolutely. No, I think another really important part of the story is social media, for sure, and the transformation it brought in 2005. I think this is a place where, again, it's sort of good to reference the Federalist Papers. They were also concerned about faction and division and tribalism, and wanted to build a set of institutions that would help tamp that down. And if you go back to Federalist 10, that's a really powerful argument about how the original design of the Constitution was supposed to fend off the problem of factionalism. We often focus on a part of the argument in that paper. So we often focus on the argument that it was representation itself that was supposed to, again, help us avoid the problem of factionalism. The idea was that representatives would be people who would filter and synthesize all the diversity of views in the country and help achieve sort of moderate steering kind of view. But there was a second part of the argument, and this was an argument about geography. Madison argues that the very dispersal of the country, its spread, mountains, rivers, and the like, would mean that people with extreme views wouldn't be able to find each other easily. The only outlet they would have for their opinions would be through representatives. So geography was understood to be a forcing factor. It itself was a part of the design, sort of a premise of why the design of representative democracy was supposed to work. And social media in 2005 just knocked that premise, that pillar of the whole design, out from under us. So people can now find each other. People with extreme views can coordinate easily. They can build movements. There's no need to go through a representative to get your view into the public sphere. That's the thing I think that's been fundamentally transformative and made us vulnerable to demagogues in a very different kind of way.
Well, there's that. There's also, I think it's 1990s that Robert Putnam wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone about and really captured the rise of the lonely society. Lonely people have discovered new forms of association that go beyond actually going to gun clubs or labor union meetings or whatever, whatever groups they're joining, and finding each other digitally, right, remotely. And social media, it seems to me, has actually been a great accelerant of that phenomenon, because it's made it quite possible to maintain the pretense of a social life without ever leaving your den, or whatever, your bedroom even. So there's a psychological aspect as well in that social media, correct me if you see it differently, social media has been a great accelerant to people leading lives wholly cut off from other forms of normal connection to other people.
Well, I'm sure lots of people would say all kinds of, normal and wonderful forms of interaction are also possible on social media, right? So I think in that regard, it's a double-edged sword. I think, there are many people who can tell stories of having found communities that gave them a sense of human connection that they never had. So in that regard, I do think it's definitely, both things are true. But I think the real challenge is this question of how it is views of different kinds come together and get synthesized or gain influence in political debate and in political discussion. And, I think it can be an uncomfortable thing to recognize that we built, 250 years ago, this sort of structure of representation was built actually in part to produce a gatekeeping function, all right? That's, not often how we want to think about what our democracy was supposed to be about. And so there's a real kind of deep question there. Does democracy depend on, gatekeeping mechanisms of various sorts, or not? Or what happens? How do you keep a democracy healthy when you don't really have gatekeeping mechanisms any longer? And, again, people with all kinds of extreme views are capable of finding each other and coordinating at very, massively scaled up levels.
So democracy does not feel very healthy today. The most obvious evidence, at least to my mind, and perhaps to yours, is what happened on January 6th. But what happened on January 6th, in some ways, as shocking as it was at the time, seemed almost, I don't want to say inevitable, but totally unsurprising given the political climate that the United States found itself in. And we're now at a moment that either feels like a respite or maybe slight calm before a storm, but we obviously need to start thinking about the ways in which we might go about healing this highly frayed democratic fabric or liberal democratic fabric that we have before the next round of demagogues begin to really bid in a serious way for power. So what should Americans be thinking about? And is it just a matter of, it seems to me foolish to just cross fingers and hope for a good slate of candidates, that we need to start thinking about institutional reform and thinking about social reform. It's unclear to me what exactly that should be, but I think people would love to hear your view.
Well, it's absolutely the case. As I've been traveling around the Commonwealth of Massachusetts over the last few months and listening and learning about what people's top of mind hopes and concerns are, it's been really striking how much our national division is getting pulled into local politics. So I've heard stories of debates in a given town about whether or not to build a new library, devolving into arguments over whether or not people believe in the big lie of the stolen election. And I've had people reach out and just say, with a kind of honestly note of desperation in their voices, our community is so divided now, still fighting over the result of the election. And we're trying to figure out how to make decisions together. And we're trying to even just do things like invite people to the same social events so we can start to kind of just be in space together again. And we can't get people to come, and we don't know where to get started. So I say all that just to agree with you that we're definitely in a bad way and that people recognize this everywhere. And there is a hunger for figuring out how to break through. I think the really hard thing is that breaking through is in some sense about small actions, actually. It is really about, at any point where there's a decision to be made, a shared decision to be made, taking another look at that decision-making process and asking the question of, can we make the circle of people participating in that, bigger than it currently is? Is there, even one person, two people, five people, where we can link arms across some kind of divide and agree that we have a shared problem that we're going to try to solve together? So not necessarily try to sort of bridge all the divides at once, but just start kind of keep building out the circle of people who are actually able to work together around a shared problem. I've seen some really impressive examples in the Commonwealth. For example, the city of Revere that ran a strategic planning process for itself and really wanted to ask the question of like, what's the future of Revere that we, the people of Revere, want? And as they did that, they absolutely discovered critical issues like housing and access to health resources and the like. And those were sort of shared concerns, but then they also discovered that different parts of Revere, different communities in Revere, had a really different understanding of the history of the community. So longer residing individuals had one picture of the history of Revere, and then newcomers had a very different understanding of how to tell the story of Revere. And so that race for them to the surface, they need to actually do work on how they're going to narrate their history now in the present. And so that's now something that Revere is working on. And so that's what I mean when I say I think it's not about a sort of silver bullet or a big immediate solution, but it really is sort of the hard work of coming back to a table where we can identify some shared problems, surfacing some of those real differences of understanding about history and about our concept of who we are, and then being willing to say, okay, let's actually talk about that and see if we can weave those things together into a shared narrative. So where I see hope, I'm seeing it there at really local levels as people are trying to rebuild the capacity in specific communities to make decisions together again.
That's an important piece of the software component of democratic, liberal. I use the word democratic, and I then have to check myself, not for confusion with the Democratic Party, but just to mention the liberal aspect of democracy, the values aspect of democracy beyond the institutional one. But there's also the hardware piece beyond the software. And one of the depressing realities of I think the last 25 years of American life is we have what seems to be a permanent Congress that is never particularly afraid, thanks to the partisan gerrymander of a challenge from the other side, from a candidate from the other party. The challenge is always from the candidate from your own party. So it's always the fight between the center and some leftward or rightward extreme, depending on the party. There's the question of the filibuster. There's the question also of the way in which we regulate the new great utilities of our time, which are the digital utilities. So what should serious people thinking about renewing democracy, major institutional reform, what should they be thinking about? And I guess one fourth thing that I'd love your thoughts about, we just had an election in New York City that took a while to find what the result was, a primary election based on ranked choice voting. This is a really interesting system, and I would love your thoughts on that too. So that's a whole slew of questions. Take them in any order you'd like.
Why don't we focus on ranked choice voting and the filibuster? I think those are two critical reforms, and there's actually a way in which they belong together in our minds. So as lots of folks now know, having watched New York, in ranked choice voting, you vote your first choice person, your second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and the like. If your top person is a low vote getter, your vote gets rolled down to your next selected candidate. And what this means then is that no candidate wins until more than 50% of the people have voted for them. You have to be first past the real post of 50%. And only if you've actually built a majority do you then get to move forward and hold office. And that's just critical. And I mean, the fact that we lost sight of 50% as the actual vote threshold that counts as winning an election is extraordinary. The founders knew 50% was the goal, and they would often use repeated runoffs to get there. Lincoln's election as nominee depended on a runoff system until he got over that 50% threshold. They never had any illusions about it. They would have thought it was bizarre that we let people move forward as a nominee with 22% or 25% of the vote, for example. The reason this matters is because when your target is at least 51%, you have the job of building a coalition that has to bridge differences. On the other model, the first past the post model as we currently use it, you can just divide. You can, hammer the concrete of the public into a wedge that happens to be your wedge, just a wee bit bigger than somebody else's, and stand on that. That's a real driver of the division in our politics. So that 50% mark is really critical. Now, when I say that, that actually pertains to the filibuster as well. The founders were super, super clear that you need different thresholds of voting for different categories of decision. For the Declaration of Independence, breaking from Britain, unanimity was the requirement. That was the standard. They weren't going to do it for anything less than that. For the constitutional ratification, supermajority, 9 states was enough to change the Constitution. Constitutional level questions, supermajority. But legislative questions, ordinary business, routine business, bare majority. That was the idea. You had to distinguish between categories of decision. The fact that we now use the filibuster to require a supermajority for absolutely every single piece of business is just a real mistaken understanding of what the basic dynamics of self-government and democracy require. You have to have motion and fluidity. That's what you need in order even just to hold people to account, so that when they have a view, they can actually act on it, and then we can hold them to account. We can't hold people to account right now because they can't do anything. So we need to restore dynamism to our Congress. Abolishing the filibuster, from my point of view, is a critical reform.
And what about the partisan gerrymander? Is that beyond hope of cure because of the court, or is it a cause worth promoting?
No, I do think that independent redistricting commissions are key. And we've seen great forward movement with, for example, achieving that by ballot proposition in Michigan and the like. And no, absolutely, I think we want to, in different states, it requires a different mechanism to get to independent redistricting commissions, but that should absolutely be the goal.
I want to give our audience a chance to ask their questions, but I want to ask you also, because you're an educator, and I remember I actually got to read your book. This is just a little aside. I gave a talk at Northwestern, and yours, our declaration was the all-campus read.
Oh, yes.
Which
Yeah.
I thought was fantastic. What was really cool about it is I not only got the book, I got the T-shirt.
Oh, that's great. My daughter still sleeps in her T-shirt from that.
Well, sadly, I got too fat for the T-shirt, so my son now has the T-shirt.
Okay.
But it's still floating around in our home.
Fantastic.
Somewhere. But the point of that is that you wrote a book that was not just a work of scholarship and of great scholarship. You wrote a book that was a piece of civic education, and that really made. I mean, I think your intended audience was wide and sophisticated, but it was also a book that a smart freshman or first-year student at a place like Northwestern could really read and understand. I think there's a sense, I don't think I'm going out on any limb, that we're in desperate need for refurbishing civic education. So what are your pointers if you were imagining that there are educators in this audience or people in the position to, create curricula for high school students and college students? What should they be doing that they're not now?
Well, I had the pleasure and privilege over the last about 2 years now of co-leading with others, a project called the Educating for American Democracy Initiative. This was jointly sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the US Department of Education. And it started out with about 6 of us working together. We pulled together a group of people that bridged academic specialties, bridged geography, bridged demography, and bridged ideology to answer the charge put to us by the NEH of how, as a country, we could achieve excellence in history and civics learning for all learners K through 12. And we released the roadmap to Educating for Excellence in Educating for American Democracy in early March. And so I would recommend everybody go check it out on the website. And that group of 6, where we started, grew to a group of 300. And I'm wanting to share this detail because this is the point I was making about sort of snowballing of collaboration across our divides. And so ultimately a group of 300 people from all over the country, and again, crossing ideological lines, linked arms and said, we agree there's a problem. Kids are not getting the opportunities they need for a rich development of understanding of the foundations of liberal democracy, for an understanding of constitutional democracy, for an understanding of social movements and transformation in this country over time, for an understanding of rights and responsibilities, nor are they getting the opportunity to understand their own possibilities for empowerment, their own civic roles, and how they might think about their jobs as participants in our society. And so we mapped out a set of themes, we mapped out a set of pedagogical strategies, and so it's there. The answer to the question of the way we can support civic learning K through 12 is in the roadmap for Educating for American Democracy, and I would recommend everybody take a look. A lot more I could say about it. I could probably go on forever about it, but I'll just give you that teaser.
Okay, let's go to some of the questions that we have from people who are signed in. One thing, someone wrote that it's a bit insulting to assume people who are on Twitter are in a dark bedroom. Point well taken, and to whoever sent in that question, to Dana, my apologies. That was a bit of a dumb shorthand on my part. Suzanne Mary writes, is extremism more of a problem than the binary divisions such as the two-party system and then us kind of thinking? I'm gathering that the issue here is not so much that we're divided into parties, but that the parties are moving in spiraling in outward directions.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have a problem for sure with our degree of polarization. And we see that just in the dysfunction of our decision making. The fact that our Congress got stuck from May to September of last year in the effort to pass COVID response to support things like testing and contact tracing. In the middle of a national emergency, our polarization really blocked forward movement on critical policy. So it's a deep problem, but that is where I think ultimately it does really come back to some of those just nuts and bolts of incentive structures. Again, I do end up thinking that ranked choice voting is just an extremely valuable reform, precisely because it does mean that people have to work to campaign to build those bigger coalitions. So yes, I mean, our polarization is absolutely a vulnerability.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. Just a brief interjection that a healthy democracy is a politics where the fringe tends to bend towards the center, right? Because it seeks the respectability of the center. And what we've entered into is a world in which the center is constantly bending towards the fringe. One side bending a little more than the other, but that's a story for another day. A question, research, or I guess scholarship, on how often the supporters of demagogues see them as demagogues. Does history teach us anything on how to deal with demagogues? Actually, a very interesting question. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And again, that's where it's a hard one, right? So again, that original meaning of the word just meant leader of the people. It was in ancient Athens just the word for politician, okay? Every single politician was referred to by people as a demagogues. I mean, that's just what the word was, leader of the people. So then it came to have a negative valence, and the negative valence really is connected to what I was trying to describe of where institutions get replaced by a kind of personalization of power. And that's when we get into that really dangerous place. Obviously one of the worst examples the world's ever generated of this phenomenon is Nazi Germany. And, I think the sort of the long-standing project that Germany undertook to change its understanding of its own history, change its self-conception, is a good example of the answer to the question that, regrettably, a lot of people under the spell of Hitler in that period of time were not, they wouldn't have said that they were under the spell of a demagogue. And it took a real process of Germany sort of grappling with its history for the German people to recognize the truth of that designation. So it's really challenging. I think this is where some of the learnings from truth and reconciliation processes come in and are relevant. When you get to contexts of political violence, it does often mean that worldviews have come radically far apart from one another. And even a side doing incredibly terrible things has a worldview in which it makes sense to them to be doing those things. Like that's the sort of the hardest and worst part of the challenge of dealing with demagoguery.
On that theme, does it behoove those of us who were appalled by January 6th, not only appalled, but shaken, disturbed, outraged, that we should be in some way entering the minds of those who not only stormed the Congress, the Capitol, but who apologized for them? I mean, what should we be trying to understand from them?
Well, so, you know, I've written some about this for the Washington Post, and I have drawn—
Terrible newspaper, but otherwise.
Oh, well, you know, that's why you haven't seen it, because you're not reading the right stuff, Bret. So, you know, I drew on the literature on truth and reconciliation processes around the world. And that literature makes the case that there are 4 categories of truth. I'm going to go through these. And to say that there are 4 categories of truth is not to make a claim about relativism. Okay, I'm going to want to be very clear about that too. So what are these 4 categories of truth? There's forensic truth. That's the truth that courts achieve for us when they litigate the facts of the matter. And they do the best job they possibly can to, through litigation, really clarify specifically, you know, who did what to whom and how and with what harms and all of these kinds of things. And so we are getting forensic truth from the January 6th events as people are prosecuted, as they're receiving sentences and the like. The second category of truth is personal truth. And what this means, sometimes people hear that and think, oh, is that relativism? That's not relativism. The point is, every one of us watching those events saw something and saw meaning in that day. And given our perspective, we'll have had somewhat different meanings that we saw. I saw the Confederate flags. Like that's really what stood out to me in that day. Other things may have stood out more to other people. So depending on what stood out, you know, I saw white supremacy. Other people saw concern about an election, right? So different people saw different things. Just as we know in any, you know, crime incident, anything like that, it's, you know, witnesses famously have seen different things in the incident. That's what's meant by personal truths. Okay, it's like what people actually think they saw. Then the next category is what's called social truth. Now, this is actually really the hardest part. Okay, and this is sort of the kind of truth that Germany achieved after decades when they came to have the social truth of understanding the crimes that their country had committed. They had to achieve that truth over, you know, decades of work and education. And so in our case, you know, that social truth is a truth we might get, you know, start to move towards through the select committee that's at work. We would have a better chance of getting to that social truth if we had an independent commission working on understanding exactly why everything happened in January 6th and exactly what it meant. But trying to answer those questions, that's the social truth piece. And then the last part is what's called the sort of reconciliation truth, which is, you know, the forward path. What are the steps we have to take in order to actually be involved again in a sort of shared project of shared governance? And so what that means, for example, is, you know, as we try to wrestle with our social truth, there's some elements of, you know, experience or perception on the side of those who participated in January 6th that, you know, we need to understand why they are seeing the world the way they are in order to know what the possible pathways of reconciliation might be. Now, to say that we need to know that is not to say that we need to sympathize. It's not to say that we need to apologize or excuse. It's just to say that we need to understand enough in a kind of diagnostic way to know what pathway could bring people back into a healthy society where we completely avoid political violence, consider it unacceptable, and are willing to work together through political institutions. That was a very long-winded answer, Bret.
Very fascinating. Actually, that's a very fascinating answer. Another question comes from Jerome Levkov. He asks Netanyahu, the Israeli former prime minister, it's funny after all these years to say former, argues that multicultural democracy is not durable because the people don't have a quote unquote fundamental allegiance to their country. Is that accurate? And if so, does it pose a serious threat to democracy? larger question, how do we make democracy a part of someone's identity in the way that identity party affiliation appears to be? Two questions, take whichever one you want.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the goal is for each of us really to have a deep sense of our own, role, our own empowerment as, one of the people who is helping to make the decisions that shape our community. And the second part of that identity as a member of a democracy is the idea that we carry out that role through the whole raft of institutional processes. So, that is running for office. It's working on behalf of people running for office. It's sending letters to representatives. It's submitting petitions. It's developing policy and lobbying for it, advocating for it. It's social movements as well. It is nonviolent protest and all the important tools of calling people's attention to pressing moral issues, urgent matters. So that's how I think of what is really needed in a democracy. But it has to start from that conviction that one takes pleasure in, sees value in that self-governance, in that role of being an empowered decision maker who is contributing to those shared decisions.
Can I just jump in with offering a view for Levkov's question just briefly? There's a deep difference between American democracy and the American sense of civic allegiance and French democracy or republicanism, in that the way in which the French have always conceived the relationship as an unmediated relationship between the citizen and the state. Whereas American history has always been, from a very early era, a multicultural democracy. We now don't recognize how salient that was in, say, 1850, because we've forgotten about the know-nothings and the deep discomfort of Protestant America, particularly in the face of Irish Catholic immigration. Or to go 40 years into the future from there, the arrival of Eastern European Jews, of Italians, Greeks, and Poles. Of course, the Chinese immigration, which resulted in bigoted legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the notion of multicultural democracy, I mean, that ship sailed even before the American Revolution. That ship sailed with the creation of Maryland as a Catholic sanctuary as one of the original 13 colonies. So one of the joys, I think, of American democracy is you have always been able to retain your identity as Irish, Catholic, African American, whatever, without any sense of contradiction with your American identity, that the hyphenated identity is something that makes great sense in the United States. It has always made people in particularly France, because of the nature of their constitution, feel differently about. Let me take another question. You spoke earlier about prioritizing classic democratic principles in support of our democratic institutions and norms. What do you consider the most essential of those principles, and why?
Well, I mean, the first is to see that freedom and equality are like hand and glove, that they belong together, that the goal, and I keep coming back to this vocabulary of empowerment and self-governance. Each of us thrives when we can be the author of our own lives. And for us to have a healthy society, then we all need that chance. That's a chance for freedom. But in order to all of us be free, we all have to also have access to political equality, and that ability to lift our voices, contribute our actions to shared decision-making. So freedom and equality belong together like hand in glove. For me, that's the first principle of democracy, and the thing to lift up over and over and over again.
Okay. Next, Moshe B asks, with many of these changes You are with many of these changes, you're proposing taking years, if not decades, to germinate before allowing for meaningful progress. What do you believe are the chances that the ideal of American democracy will not deteriorate further in the upcoming national elections in 22 and 24?
Well, so this also gets to another really important theme, which is that in order for democracy to earn people's trust, it has to deliver. Our democracies have to actually function to solve the problems that we collectively share. So in that regard, I don't think that the solutions are necessarily, decades off. It's true. I did talk about the way in which communities need to work to rebuild their ability to work together. And that is a long-term process for sure. But at the same time, I think it's really important for all our elected officials, and this is why I'm running for office basically, to do the work of actually identifying what our hardest collective problems are and bringing people together to find solutions for them. So in Massachusetts, housing is our just #1 issue across the whole Commonwealth. And it's an issue that sometimes just gets pushed to the side by a variety of our elected leaders. We need to put it front and center, across backgrounds, across political perspectives. Housing is a problem for everybody. And we really need to put that again, front and center, and make sure operate our institutions so they can deliver solutions for that really basic human problem. A good home is the anchor for everything else in life. And so that's, I think, that's the way in which we start reconnecting people to our democracy, is to be able to be really clear-eyed and honest about what those hardest problems are that everybody's struggling with, and then get to work actually delivering in relationship to those problems.
Is there, one of the points that is increasingly made is that our divisions, socially and politically, have an algorithmic engine, which is that social media is interested in putting people into silos. It's interested in exposing them to the things that they already like. It feeds on a certain kind of tension, division, and debate. Can you imagine something like a democratic code of conduct for Silicon Valley, so to speak, that we can create algorithms that favor liberal democratic life in a way that we don't have them now? And is that something worth thinking about and doing?
Well, I think we all have to recognize that our social media platforms have co-opted the fundamental function of our system of representation. So if the fundamental function of our system of representation as designed was to give people the outlet for getting their voice into the public sphere and to synthesize and mediate and moderate and gatekeep, right? Social media has literally co-opted that function. And so currently we do have our core democratic function being operated by people who are not elected by us. And so we need to be clear-eyed and honest about that. Now, does that mean we democratize, sort of turn into public utilities, social media companies? That's one argument, line of possibility. At the moment, my own focus is on the idea that we need to really do a good job of rebuilding alternative access points and forms of information ecosystems, infrastructure for information. And in particular, I think we just really desperately need to rebuild an ecosystem of local journalism. That's another one of the key functions that our social media platforms have displaced. So I am a supporter of taxing the targeted ad revenue that social media platforms are generating and investing that in the rebuilding of an ecosystem of local journalism, a more diversified system of local journalism, giving people access to more of a variety of voices in their own community, but also making sure that those platforms are connected to legacy news institutions and can carry on the transmission of those professional standards that have anchored our legacy news organizations over time. So that's currently where my focus is. But yes, I think we all have to recognize that social media platforms have basically co-opted the core function of democratic representation.
So I'm not allowed to endorse any candidates, of course, at least either as a journalist or as a well-wisher of RDI. I don't think I'm barred from endorsing you for the presidency of Harvard if all else fails. This is I mean, really, every time I read you or listen to you, it is a masterclass in American democracy. In fact, probably a thought for masterclass itself. And a pleasure to hear someone who's so thoughtful, so learned, and so eloquent. So it's an honor to have you here. I'm going to watch the recording again, as I think many of us will, and steal all of your ideas for my columns.
You take them all. Feel free. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have to think of something I can endorse you for. So like maybe for, a position at the Washington Post. There we go.
Yes, or either that or local dog catcher, but one or the other. Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you to those who listened in so attentively. I think this was an education and a pleasure for everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bret and Danielle. For those that weren't here in the beginning, I'll just very quickly direct you, if you're interested in learning more about these types of conversations or the organization, just check out rdi.org. We're going to be hosting a bunch of these over the course of the next year, and so they'll all be very exciting. And for those of you who are joining us for our private conversation afterwards, you should have a separate link as well as a calendar invite. If you don't, you can feel free to reach out to us at info@rdi.org. We'll make sure to send that right over to you. For everyone else, I hope that you will consider joining us for future, these follow-on kind of smaller, more intimate conversations after the larger public ones. So again, thank you, Bret. Thank you, Danielle. I look forward to continuing this conversation, and thank you everyone else for joining.